Welcome, my friends. Today I will tell you a story of deception, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of love that guided a lost soul from the depths of despair back into the light. Enjoy the story. Father John wasn't always a priest. He used to have no connection to the church or anyone associated with it. He never would have dreamed that even in his wildest fantasies, he would become a man of the cloth. John worked for the police. He was a good investigator, but an honest one, which wasn't appreciated by his colleagues or his superiors. Whenever John dug into a case, he received threats more than once. But he thought that where only money was involved, it wouldn't come to bloodshed. He was wrong because huge sums of money were at stake, and digging further meant digging his own grave. But John believed in justice. The day he realized who was behind the whole scheme, he received a call. Listen, every person has something very important in life. For some, it's family. For others, it's money. In our case, it's money, and in yours, it's family. Understand? If we lose the money, you'll lose your family. How proudly he told them off back then. How proud he felt, sensing he was on the moral high ground. After lunch, he reported that the case had been cracked, and that evening, when he was about to go home, he received a call with a dry official voice telling him that his wife and son had been gunned down right on the playground. He barely remembered what happened next. Only one thing was etched into his memory. He was speeding towards the cause of his troubles, but lost control of the car and went off a curve. He spent 3 months in the hospital. His mother-in-law spat at his feet and asked, "Tell me, who needed your honesty?" He started drinking, passing out drunk, wishing for only one thing: to quickly die. That's the state Father Thomas found him in, behind the church. John lived with Father Thomas for a month. In the evenings, they had long conversations. He started helping out at the church, chopping wood, shoveling snow, and eventually decided never to return to the outside world. 7 years had passed since that moment. John had been a priest for 3 years. He always tried to help, not just with words but with deeds. More than once, he had taken in drifters like himself, warmed them up, fed them. A few people changed, if only a little, but he considered that a victory. "Father John, we can begin. Everyone's here." "Okay, I'll be there in 10 minutes. Can't you come sooner?" He looked at the woman in surprise. She was the stepmother of the young man they were burying today. No, she was too young to be his mother, so she must be his stepmother. "Go ahead. I'll be right there." This woman, carefully dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, trying to squeeze out a few tears, was clearly in a hurry. Strange. And where was the young man's father? Judging by appearances, the family was quite wealthy. John understood perfectly well it was none of his business. His role was to perform the burial rites and prepare the young man's soul. Everything else was worldly matters. But for some reason, he couldn't settle down. He approached the many people in the church, mostly youths, and stood at the back so no one would pay attention to him. A young woman, probably the deceased's fiancée or girlfriend, sat by the casket. There was no life in her face. She wasn't just suffering, she was in a daze. 2 similarly tearful girlfriends supported her. John searched for the woman who had hurried him. She stood next to a young man who possessively held her by the waist, while she angrily looked at her watch. What a piece of work, dragging her lover even here. "Dude, do you know something?" If only. But when his father died, the will said that this bitch is only the guardian until Toby gets married. You think he just happened to die 2 weeks before the wedding? The young people talking stood right in front of him. John tensed up, but then remembered he wasn't an investigator anymore. His role was to help souls find peace, including this young man's soul. It wasn't to blame. "Maybe we should go to the police." "What good would that do? You don't know who her lover is?" "No. Who?" "The nephew of our police chief." What a mess. Toby must have suspected something. Just a week before he died, I overheard him talking to Kathy. She was crying, begging him to drop whatever he was planning. You know Toby, he just laughed and said as soon as he exposed certain people, he'd calm down. Then they went inside from the balcony and I didn't hear any more. But I'm totally sure he was talking about his dear stepmom. John sighed. Nothing had changed in this world. Absolutely nothing. the same lies, the same cruelty. He had done the right thing leaving it all behind. The woman was visibly nervous, and John headed to the front of the church. Everything was ready for the burial service, but something kept nagging at him. He wanted to delay the moment, as if the young man had some unfinished business. He glanced at the casket. Yes, very young, 25 at most. He was about to step away from the casket and take his place when the girl who had just been crying suddenly jumped up and immediately collapsed to the floor. People rushed to her. The smell of smelling salts wafted through the air. The woman rushed over too. "Catherine, stop putting on this circus act." Her voice echoed under the vaulted ceiling. John touched her arm. "Please, don't speak so loudly." "What? Just start already. How much longer do we have to wait?" "Forgive me, but if something is preventing the burial rites, it means the person's soul hasn't completed its earthly affairs." "What nonsense are you spewing? What soul? Don't give me that heresy. Just start." They seated the girl back in a chair. John leaned towards her. "How are you feeling?" She lifted her eyes to him. He had never seen such pain. Her gaze was one solid wound. She silently lowered her eyes. And finally, John decided to begin. The burial rites proceeded as usual, until at one point when it was required, he approached the casket, leaned over slightly, and suddenly fell silent. He remained silent for a full minute, standing bent over. The girl, astonished, looked at him with something like hope, as if waiting for him to say they were all mistaken, that Toby was alive. "What's the matter?" The stepmother's shrill voice echoed under the vaulted ceiling again. But Kathy just kept looking at the priest. How she had dreamed of happiness. How she had loved Toby. How scared and weighed down she felt now. When they met, Toby's father was already ill. The doctors gave differing prognoses. Some promised 3 years, others 1 year. He lived a year and a half. That's when Kathy understood, though she had suspected it earlier, that money didn't rule this world. Toby's father had plenty of it, but it didn't help him at all. After the father's funeral, Toby said they needed to get married right away. She remembered being so surprised. "Toby, it's been so little time since your dad passed away." He looked at her and said, "That's exactly what Dad asked me to do when he was dying. He said it's the only way I'll be safe. If only he knew what I might be in danger from." He didn't know, and Kathy didn't know. But his father understood what he was talking about, and today proved it. John didn't know what to do. For the first time in his life he was so bewildered. Properly he should continue the burial rites, but he couldn't. The cause of his confusion was what he had seen. If he hadn't worked in law enforcement, he might not have noticed this detail. An ordinary person wouldn't know what it was, but he did. He had even worked with such a thing once before. He looked at the deceased and saw that in one spot, the face mask had detached. Those masks were extremely expensive, and as far as he recalled, it was very difficult for an ordinary person to obtain one legally. Unless, of course, you were friends with the makeup artist for stage performers, then it was possible. He glanced sideways at the girl. Again that terrible gaze. Oh well, whatever happens. Yes, he was a priest, not an investigator, but he couldn't perform last rites for one person when someone else lay before him. John took the edge of the mask and gently pulled. People watched in horror as the mask easily came off, revealing a completely different person in the casket. This was a man of about 30, clearly from an underprivileged background. John straightened up, and the people around gasped. He saw the stepmother and her companion almost running towards the exit. He was about to shout for someone to stop her when the church doors burst open. Sunlight flooded in, and standing in the rays was the very young man whose face he had just held in his hands. Behind him were several men in uniform. "Hello, Mommy dearest. Where's the fire? Off to the reading of the will. Too bad you won't be able to hear it." The young man's head was bandaged, and John immediately realized there had been an attempt on his life, just an unsuccessful one. The girl slowly started to stand. John managed to catch her as she started to tilt sideways. Her girlfriends and friends rushed over, and the priest handed Kathy over to them, saying, "Get her some air." The woman who had been hurrying him turned to her companion and shouted, "Well, what are you standing there for? Do something!" He looked at her, eyes wide. "Me? What am I supposed to do? You're the one who did all this. You deal with it. I'm not getting involved. She was almost choking with indignation. Me? This was all your idea. You promised me everything would work out fine. Are you out of your mind? I didn't know anything about this. The woman lunged at her boyfriend, fists flying, while John grimaced. The men in uniform quickly escorted them outside. Now you'll have time to accuse each other, Toby said, looking around at everyone present. He saw Kathy. Kathy! The girl stepped towards Toby and fell into his embrace. Forgive me, my dear. I just had to rush to the Capitol. You know our police won't investigate anything. I never dreamed they'd stage my death. John gave them a few minutes, then asked, Well, what do we do now? Toby glanced at the casket, the hearse from the funeral home, and the funeral home staff. Were you paid for everything? They nodded, though it took a minute since they had been standing there with their mouths open for about 5 minutes. We need to perform the rites for this man and bury him, if the police officers allow it. In any case, it's all paid for. Just don't put a nameplate with my name on it. They did eventually hold the funeral for the homeless man the next day. As John saw this person on their final journey, he thought it was probably his last time performing the rites, since there was just too much injustice in that world that needed to be fought. A day later, he left the church, feeling a little strange to realize that if he returned, it would only be as a parishioner. John turned around. One of the men who had come with Toby, though now in civilian clothes, stood before him. He had seemed familiar then, and now John remembered him. Matthew, if I'm not mistaken. Correct. You were my mentor once. We should talk. About what? The police force in your city will be almost completely disbanded, and we need people to take leadership roles, people who won't give up or break. I know everything that happened to you, my sincerest condolences, but I wanted to discuss the possibility of you returning. John smiled slightly. There's a decent cafe nearby. It's been ages since I've had some terrible food. So what's this about? Shall we go? Matthew smiled. Maybe a round of drinks for old time's sake, too? A month later, there was a knock at the door. John was very surprised and went to answer it. Only a handful of people knew he was back here. Toby and Kathy stood on the doorstep. Excuse me, I used my father's connections to track you down. Well, you found me. Is something wrong? No. Kathy and I came to invite you to our wedding. John smiled. So many events, he could barely process them all. Kathy frowned. Just don't say you're not coming. I won't. I'll be there. Someone has to bless you two. If you like the story, please support me with a thumbs up button. And to learn about the release of new interesting stories, when subscribing, click the bell. All the best to you.